thank you all for coming. Appreciate it, especially since it's lunchtime. And not trying to sabotage, but there's a really cool lightning talk happening right now that I want to go to. So thank you all for coming. Just want to get a quick pulse on the room. My aim is for this to be really helpful for y'all in making stuff and contributing and doing cool things on Nostr. So, God willing, that's what we'll do here today. Wanted to get a quick pulse check on the room, though. If I could, by show of hands, see who here is on Nostr. If I ask for your npub right now, okay, so that's most everyone. So this is the hardcores here. Most everyone, not everyone, but most. That makes sense. So I can sort of tailor this presentation. How many of y'all are developers, or how many of y'all program? It doesn't have to be professionally, but if I asked you, do you program? Okay, so some. Okay, gotcha. That was going to be my next question. Who here would consider themselves, again, you don't have to do it professionally, but who is a designer here? By show of hands. Okay, cool. That's really exciting. One last question. How many of y'all contribute to open source projects or are involved in any way? Cool. All right. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Really, the point of my talk is not kind of how you all need Nostr or to do things on Nostr. It's more like how Nostr needs you all, and how I think the stuff that's happening on Nostr could really benefit from more engagement from people in the community, especially thinking with a design mindset. So I'll go ahead and jump in. Okay, so the talk is Nostr product design. Like a lot of you all, I'm here because these are my favorite things. So I'm very excited to talk about these. This is Nostr and design is what I'm all about. So a quick outline of what we'll be talking about today. I want to get through the material quickly so that this can be more of a true workshop. So yeah, I want to get through the material quickly and then have time for questions, and then to go deeper on whatever y'all would like to have a closer look at as far as the examples. But what we'll be covering today is an introduction to me, just so you can understand who I am and my perspective. An intro to Nostr for those of y'all that are less familiar. Design fundamentals, that's the core of the talk, because we're going to be talking about design, what design is, and who does design, and how that's done. We'll also be talking about working with developers, so collaborating in the open source space, which is something that in the past year I've learned a lot about, so that's what I'm excited to share. I'll also have a call to action. That's kind of what I was speaking to earlier. I think Nostr really needs people who, if you're here, if you're listening, to engage, to give feedback, to participate, to design. That's really what I think could enable Nostr to grow and become something that is impactful in the space. Excuse me. And then I'll end with a toolkit of different resources that hopefully will be helpful, and give tools to y'all if you want to participate in building cool stuff on Nostr. Okay, so quick introduction to me. Not that it matters too much, but just so you understand where I'm coming from. This is me on Nostr, John B, at John B if you want to reach out to me or do collaborate or anything like that. I am a UX designer. That stands for User Experience Designer. That's my day job, and it's also what I do for fun for a lot of this stuff. So I'm always doing this, which is what I was referring to, this is the stuff that excites me. I'm working on a bunch of different projects, like a lot of people, too many probably. If you don't know too much about Nostr, I'll give an introduction, but a lot of these have to do with Nostr. They're sort of, how can we use Nostr to decentralize game publishing, like a Steam or a itch.io, if y'all are familiar. This client is one of the long-form text clients. So you can think about Substack or Medium.com. These are the kinds of problems that we're looking to bring a more decentralized, more Bitcoin-minded, this is a Bitcoin conference after all, a more Bitcoin-minded thought process and some of those advantages about decentralization and sovereignty over the content. So I'm involved in these things, and these are sort of my passion projects. Okay, so quick introduction to Nostr. For those that are unfamiliar, the way that I like to break it down, and again, as I'm not a super technical person, so this is kind of a layman's definition. The more technical people in here might correct me. But I think this will be good enough for now. Nostr is a decentralized social media protocol. So I'm going to break those down piece by piece. First is that it's decentralized. The way that I like to think about this is to contrast it with the current legacy social media stack as far as the technology. So in the legacy stack, you have, as a lot of y'all will be familiar, servers where all the data lives. And, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they have those huge complexes full of servers. That's where all the data lives. Then you have the client layer, which, like on X or formerly Twitter, you have one app for now. So all that data is stored on servers. You interface with it on an app. And then the way that you get into that app experience is that you have an account, and you have to make an account with them. The Nostr stack is completely different. So, and a lot of y'all are familiar with Nostr, so I'll go through this. But instead of servers, you have relays. Relays are ways of hosting data, kind of like nodes on the Bitcoin network. So a lot of the same kind of value for decentralization, a lot of the same thinking has gone into Nostr, which is why, it's so popular among Bitcoiners. But you have these relays instead of the massive server farms where the data lives. No one entity controls all the data. Instead, it's decentralized. On the client layer, again, you have more decentralization. It's many apps. So to interact with the Nostr protocol, you do not have to go through one app where they have the advertisers waiting for you and they take your data. This is the value that we talk about when we talk about Nostr. So you have many apps. Some of them could be advertising based. Some of them could be subscription. It's just a whole world of possibility. And that to me, this as a designer, this is where a lot of the exciting opportunities to build on Nostr live. So many apps and many kinds of apps also, which I think y'all have heard about some today. And then to this point, this is a question that a gentleman was asking before, is when it comes to accounts, the way that you interface with your account on Nostr is through this set of keys. And again, there's a lot of similarity between Bitcoin and Nostr here. You have a set of public keys that people see you as, that's your identity. And then you have a set of private keys, which, the metaphor is not exactly correct, but it's sort of like a password. It's something you keep secret, and you're in charge of custodying, to use a Bitcoin term. But this is how you interface with the app layer, which interfaces with the data layer. And the way you do that is changing. Like a lot of stuff on Nostr is changing, but this is the fundamentals. This is the value that it brings. And this is what we're referring to when we say that it's decentralized. Okay, so second part of the definition, decentralized social media protocol. Social media, I'll go ahead and say, like, it's a part of the definition, but it's not really that great of a way to describe what's happening. It's really information more broadly. So, these are examples of some apps, some of which you've heard of today, like Flockster, Primal, Yonder. You may not consider Google Maps to be social media, but it's something that Nostr could be an input into. The data layer could input into geographical data about where you are and what places you visit and ratings and things like that. So not everything on Nostr has to be like X. It has to be like Twitter or Reddit or some of these products that are typically associated with social media. It really could be a wide variety of things. Okay. So now I'm going to start talking about design. Okay, this is the part that I really want to drive home and to kind of ask everyone here in the room is, who is a designer? I think a lot of times we have in our head, y'all came to this talk thinking probably already of what a designer is and what this talk is going to be about. So I want to look at that as a question for a second. Who is a designer? Who do we normally think of when we think of who can design or who should design? Should you be a designer? Do you have the right skill set for it? And I think a lot of the time we think about someone like this penguin gentleman over here, who is artistic, who has that kind of skill set, or a natural talent or ability to do things that are visual, that are beautiful a lot of the time is how it's framed. Is like, oh, that's a very beautiful design, or artistic. So in my concept, this is a lot of how we refer to designers. So then the question that I'd like to ask is, can you be a designer? If it's something like that, where you have to have that kind of skill set or that capability, a lot of times I think we can think, well, I'm not disposed to that skill set. I don't have those skills. I'm not artistic in that way. So maybe, I'm not sure what you all might be thinking about yourselves, but that's a question. Can you be a designer? And really the distinction I'm trying to make here is between visual design and what I mentioned before, UX or user experience design. Visual design, like we saw before, is typically associated with a skill set, an artistic skill set, a visual skill set. It involves the capability to do those kinds of things. So if that's the case, what is UX design? It's a question. As opposed to a skill set or something that you can be talented in, user experience design is something different. It's a process. So I'd like to get into that. And the point that I'm trying to drive home is that it's a process that anyone can do. It's a process that you don't have to have a particular natural capability for. It really is just a procedure. It's a set of steps. And this framework is used often in the UX world to describe this process. And I'll just go through it here briefly. But fundamentally, to give you all the overview, it's about understanding users of software products, usually software, understanding them, and then understanding their problems and letting that inform the direction of how the software is made. So I'll go through the steps here quickly. The first step is empathize. So again, thinking in this different framework about design, that it's not just visual components, it's not just whether or not something looks beautiful. The first step is actually empathizing with and understanding a user and their problems. And you'll often hear, I think, when UX is mentioned, if you've heard some of these talks, is, oh, this app is frustrating. This app is terrible because it doesn't do what I want it to do. It gives me all kinds of problems and it doesn't work. Is maybe some common feedback about some apps. So the first step in the design thinking process is not to, especially if you're making apps, it's very easy to think, oh, they don't get how to use it. That's what the problem is. Almost like not empathizing with the user is oftentimes natural. So like as a part of this process, this discipline process, it's a very intentional move to empathize with the user, to understand where they're coming from. Next is, and again, a lot of this is centered around problems or things that need to be solved. That's fundamentally what software is. It's just trying to address problems or to improve an experience. So the next is define. So in order to solve a problem, you really ought to have a clear understanding of what it is and to define it. Next, and I'll go into examples of each of these and I think it'll become clear, but next is ideating. This is oftentimes the most fun part. This is what a lot of times I feel like people who are involved in making software or contributing to it or giving feedback, they like to jump to this step of, why don't we do this? Or wouldn't it be cool if we did that? But really it's a step along a process that is dependent on really understanding the user and their problems. Next is prototyping and testing. So before you give the full commitment to make a piece of software, which is oftentimes very expensive or time consuming, you can test your ideas. You can test them in the form of questions. You can ask users, what if we did this? Or, you can show them a sketch or a mock-up that allows them to visualize what the solution would be before you build it. And then when you test it, you can evaluate it, how well it addresses their problems. Okay, so going into each of the steps here, just making sure I'm good on time. This is some of the stuff that I'd like to go back to depending on the questions. Like I said, I want to go through the material quickly and then come back to any of the examples that y'all would like more in-depth conversation on. But when it comes to empathizing, and with a lot of these things, there are exercises, there are kind of tasks that designers can do to walk through and conduct these steps. You know, it's not, those steps that I mentioned before aren't just things that happen in someone's head, in someone's mind as they're thinking about software. A lot of times there are exercises that can be done that help with those different stages. So some of these for empathizing with the user are user flows and journey maps. This is very common in the UX world. I mean, this is a common first step to understanding the user and their problem. It's very hard to see. Like I said, I can come back and blow this up if we want to look at it more in depth. But on the left-hand side, this is a journey map that I did for Obla.news. It's one of the long-form Nostr clients. And what you see is stages in the journey of a user using the app. So you can't really see the text, but it sort of starts off like user logs in. Then the next step might be user tries to find a particular piece of content using search. And then mapped against that is how they're feeling or what kind of problems they're running into. So this can seem very basic, maybe, of like, oh, they're doing okay. And then, but the point is to highlight where their pain points are. That's something that gets mentioned a lot in design, which is where are the user's pain points, because that's where a lot of the improvements can make a big difference. Over here on the right is an example of how some of these insights from the user flow and journey exercise were taken out and then categorized by how hard they would be to implement, how valuable they would be to implement to the user. So again, this is based on the empathizing step. It's about understanding the user and really getting organized about tackling their problems and understanding their problems. Next step, define. So there are a lot of different tools and exercises that can be done for a lot of these stages, but I'm just highlighting some of the most common ones. User stories, again, this is one that I did for Obla.news, and jobs to be done are two that I'd like to cover. So if you're in the product design world, these ought to be very familiar, but they're just a way of documenting a problem and usually communicating that to the rest of the team. So I've been talking about design this whole time. You know, they play a role on a larger team, and in this space and open source, especially with developers. So we're talking about these things about understanding the user, about understanding their problems. This needs to be communicated out to the rest of the team, to the developers who will actually be implementing the solutions. So user stories are just one way of doing that. They have a common format, which is as a certain kind of user, I want to, so that's their goals, understand the user and their goals. I want to do X so that something else can happen. So, and that helps you understand their real motivation, the value they're getting from the product. So this is an example. As an author, and again, this is a long form writing client, I want to be able to select which relays, and we'll get more into relays and some of those flows. I publish to, so that I can choose how each article is broadcasted and curated. So that's the value they're getting. So again, like this is a very simple, I mean, this is just writing a sentence basically, but it's a standardized way of communicating an idea about the user to a broader software team. Jobs to be done, I don't have an example of, I don't think, no. But that's another very useful exercise. Again, it's really just a sentence or it's an idea. The kind of common fun example for jobs to be done by the people who invented it were a McDonald's milkshake. That's kind of the classic jobs to be done example, which is you might think a milkshake does a certain job of satisfying someone's desire for a milkshake. But when they looked at it with this framework, they understood that the milkshake was actually fulfilling a need, a user need. And again, it's not software, it's just an experience of giving people something to eat in the morning. They found that in their sales, McDonald's, I think was the company, that milkshakes were bought much more heavily in the morning for people's commute. So using that framework, they understood, milkshakes, I wouldn't do that, but that's just what they found in the data. That's kind of like a part of the testing, testing, you really get to see what's actually happening. But yeah, so that's the framework of jobs to be done. It helps you find things that may not be intuitive about your product and actually see what user needs and problems that your product is actually fixing. It may not be the ones that you think that they're fixing. So when you're looking to solve problems before you actually have a product, you can try to think ahead about the jobs that the user wants to be done. They're not necessarily the jobs that you can most easily fix, but it's very good to understand what they actually want. Okay, so ideation, we talked about this phase. It's usually a lot of fun. It's usually very collaborative. This is just an example of some whiteboarding I've done on one of the projects that I've worked on. It's very low fidelity. That's the thing to understand about this phase, is that when you're ideating in design, it's something that you treat the ideas with not a lot of weight. These ideas that you toss around are intentionally discarded and reimagined and maybe brought back in with a lot of frequency. That's kind of the point of this phase. And that's why it's so collaborative. You get on a whiteboard with a team of people and you start whiteboarding ideas, you start sketching them, and you can do that really quickly if it doesn't take a lot of work to produce something like this. So that's the point of this phase. Like I mentioned, so a sketch, this is a sketch, obviously something just hand done. Wireframes, that pertains to a lot of and this can be done digitally or physically, but it refers to a lot of the notes you see on the side and the ways that the screens are linked together. So again, with software products, when you make a wireframe, you're trying to show how a user would interact with an app. So in this example, search goes to this page. And it's kind of hard to see because my sketching is so bad, but if you click on a result, then you go to this page, and then here are some annotations about what would happen on that page. So this is sketches and wireframes as a part of the ideation process. Okay, prototyping. This is a higher level above. So what you're looking at right here, it looks like ablo.news. It looks like the full website, but this is actually something that I made in a tool for designers. If you're in software, you'll probably recognize Figma is a very common designer tool that's used to build these kinds of prototypes, and they're higher fidelity. So this is not a website, but it looks exactly like a website, and you can program or you can input different interactions into it, or you can have a very specific test for a user. So as a designer coming in, we've gone through the ideation phase. We think we know what we want to do. I'll go make a prototype. And that will happen much faster than it would take a team of developers to actually make something like this. And then the reason that this happens is because when it's higher fidelity, it's easier to see some potential problems. It's just a higher level of clarity. And then it's also easier to test. So when you get into a room, virtual or real room with users, and you put this in front of them, the closer to the real thing as you can get, that's valuable. They'll be able to see and interact with it in a way that you can observe ahead of time, which leads into the next and the final step, which is testing. So with testing in my UX work that I do outside of Bitcoin and Nostr, it's all virtual. It's more common now, but you can certainly get into a room, hop into a call with people who really like your target demographic for a product. If you're interested in design and you don't even have a prototype or even sketches to test, you can still do user testing and user interviews. That's something I'm going to mention in a bit, but these steps aren't necessarily linear. They're kind of cyclical. You can go through the steps and then you can do certain parts again. And really that's kind of like an iterative process that a lot of software outfits use to continue improving a product. But on this point of testing, like I was saying, you don't even necessarily have to have a prototype to test. You can and let's say you want to make an app for skateboarders, or you want to make some kind of experience for them, you can go and talk to them. You can ask them questions. You can glean insights about what their problems might be, like what we were talking about earlier, and doing that step of empathizing. So you can ask them who they are, their profile, and their demographic, because it's important to understanding where they're coming from. It may not be directly related to whatever kind of experience you're building, but to understand that, oh, they live in this part of the country or part of the world, it may give you some insight into who they are and how they will use your product. You can give them tasks. So if you have a prototype to test, you can ask them to do specific things to make sure that that part of your app is working as far as the user experience. So if you have an app, you can say, can you search for this specific thing in this app? And then they can use your prototype to try to do that. And if they fail, then you take a note of that. And if they do it successfully, or you can time them, there are all sorts of metrics that you can use to evaluate how well your design is performing. It's important here to, as you're asking these questions, as you're asking them to do tasks, to not be leading. That's a very easy thing to do in the software design world is, you put something in front of a user and you might say, doesn't this look great? Or, that's a very leading question. Or, if you bake too much into the question and they're not open-ended, then you can sort of, bias their response. And then quantitative ratings, that's just another way of some of those metrics that we were talking about. Okay, so this is the point that I wanted to make, is that it's not necessarily 1, 2, 3. It's not, always going to go in that order of these different steps. And it's actually really important to, if you've got through ideation to prototyping testing, that if you test something and it doesn't work well, it's actually the whole idea to go back and to reassess some of the earlier steps and to even do some of those exercises again. And things change. That's another important note, which is, in our skateboarder example, some development might happen in the skateboarding community, or, some kind of law might be passed that changes things for whatever experience you're building. So it's important to reassess and to go through this process iteratively. And all this, the point of all this, kind of like to the comments I was making before about visual design versus experience design, is not to make experiences or apps or software that are beautiful or like nice looking. It's to make apps that address problems, that really tackle a person's frustrations and needs. So this door is very poorly designed, as you all see. And it's not because it doesn't look nice, it's because the way that you interact with it makes you think that you should pull it. Like I'm sure y'all have seen like these doors, well designed, because you can push them and they look like you can push them. So the same problems exist in software. And like, all of you use software. You've seen where a button looks like it should be doing something and it does something else. And that's really the bottom line of what we're talking about. We're talking about a process that will hopefully lead us to making and contributing to and giving feedback on software that makes it more functional, more usable, and not necessarily more pretty, although, that's nice too. Okay, want to go through working with developers. It's a very important kind of step in the design process. Like I mentioned, like all these things are not happening with one person. The empathizing, the designing, the prototyping, it's happening on a team. And in this space, in Bitcoin and on Nostr, a lot of that is happening open source. So that has a particular structure to it that I like to kind of go into and describe. Okay, it's kind of a silly picture, but the concept I'm trying to describe here is how on a software team, it's really important to understand who has the decision-making power. In companies like the one I work for, and basically in a professional context, when you're designing something and you're building software, it's very clear where the decision power is coming from. And this chart kind of shows it. If you're familiar with product design and software world, these will be very familiar terms, but just to go into it a bit, so that's UX, that's what we were just talking about, design, user experience. Tech, those are the developers, people who actually code and program. And then there's the business. So in a professional context, that's where the decisions are coming from. Those people are referred to as product management. And the reason that this is important to go into is because when you're making a piece of software, you have to make decisions about what you're doing. There's a famous quote that I can't attribute correctly, but something like, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And that's, I think, used a lot in economics, but it's true in software design also, where we're talking about needs and problems and those kinds of things. But truly, there are no solutions that satisfy everyone. You have to make trade-offs and you have to make decisions about what you're actually going to solve for. So that has to come from somewhere. If you're on a team and it's not clear who's making decisions and who has decision-making power, then it can be very difficult to move forward when a decision needs to happen. So this is how it works in the professional context in the business world. In open source, and it's basically like Nostr and Bitcoin and open source development, there is oftentimes not a business presence. There's no money, basically. So if you bring the money, then you get to make the decisions. That's how it works. But in open source and a lot of these communities where everyone is really just volunteering their time, it's the developers who have the decision-making power. Because at the end of the day, I can make a design, it can be tested, it could be like the best product ever. But if I can't find a developer who will actually make it, then it won't exist. And on the flip side, if a developer wants to make something and it doesn't have any of that design thinking or process input into the beginning, he or she will make it, because they really have the decision-making power. So for people who are interested in design, what that means is that you have to persuade. Because since you don't have the decision-making power, since I can't code, like a lot of this talk, for the developers in the room, I think, I'd like to communicate kind of where non-coders and designers like myself are coming from. But for those of us who can't code but still want to contribute in open source and be active and do design, this is a message for us, for me also, which is that, we can't really dictate terms. We have to do the design thinking process in a way that is persuasive, because ultimately, we're trying to persuade developers to actually build these things. So I'd like to go quickly over some of how we can do that. One way is that you can work with people In talking with some of the people here, it's kind of funny to me sometimes, like they'll mention, oh, I really want to build some app, or I want to build an experience on Nostr or be involved in some way. I just can't code. And then like their spouse is a developer or something like that. So, if you have people in your network, the people who are closest to you already are, they're easier to persuade or coerce. You can pressure them in some way. But that's one way. I have a brother who's a developer. He's not on Nostr, or he wasn't, but Nostr is very open. It's, there's a bit of a learning curve, but purple pilling him has been useful for me because now we can collaborate on projects. So that's sort of an example of that. You can pay them. That's another way. This kind of circumvents what I was talking about earlier about persuading, but this is a legitimate option, which is, it's sort of like that framework before that I mentioned. If you are bringing the money, then you can make the decisions. And there are ways to do this on a budget. And this project, this is one of the projects I work on that's kind of like 3D galleries on Nostr, like a way to visually go through a 3D gallery. This was made with a friend of mine who does freelance work anyway. So, talking with him, he's my friend already. I pay him, but, it's like a friends and family kind of rate. Because Nostr is so open again, and because a lot of this work is open source, Open Mike mentioned Tunster, and Zapdos Stream forking that project. There is a way to get a lot of this stuff done, not using a lot of money, even if you're paying for some of the work. So that's another option. You can join someone else's project. This, I think, is very good to keep in mind, very good for me to keep in mind. Like, I really like the idea of building new and useful experiences on Nostr in the open source space, but there's a whole world of people who are also interested, and some of them have started projects already. So, you can join an existing project, and a lot of times, the developers are usually the ones leading this, will make specific calls for people to join with specific skills, and design is something that is often requested. This project, Abla.news, the developer of this long-form client, did make a call like that, like UX designers, other developers, please help with this project. So I've contributed in small ways to this project, but it's another thing to do, especially if you're interested in it. Like, I am very interested in a very high-functioning, decentralized, censorship-resistant, long-form text client, and that's what this is. And there are several other projects that are in that space also on Nostr. But for me, the mentality was almost like, if I'm not going to join this project, I'd want to build it myself. So if you have something like that in mind that you want to go out and build, someone may already be building it. And since everything is so open and collaborative, it's always an option to join someone else's project and contribute. The last thing I want to mention as far as building and contributing in this space is events. And we had an event associated with this conference, the Buildathon. And, with a lot of conferences, there are hackathons or events. And sometimes they happen purely online, sometimes they happen in person. But these are great opportunities to make your pitch, especially if you're doing design, and to try to persuade. The picture here is an example of a hackathon project I did with Arcanauts, who will be speaking later today, on a gaming client on Nostr. So kind of like a Steam, like I mentioned before, equivalent. This is that project. It was done through a hackathon, which, is very over the course of a week. This project was made, and now it exists. Now it's a real project, and I benefited not only from the experience of building the project, but also working with a new collaborator and having that relationship now where, I've learned so much, and then, I get to have a point of contact. So these are great. Using events like this are a great way to actually do design. Okay. So two big takeaways that I want to make sure to emphasize and highlight from the earlier talk we had about what UX is as opposed to visual design is that user experience design is something that everyone can do. If you're a developer in this room, if you don't know how to code and you want to be involved, you can go through that process. You can do interviews, you can make mock-ups, you can empathize, and you can do those exercises to try to understand and contribute to these kinds of projects. Everyone can do that because it is a process. It does not require you to have any kind of artistic skill. And on the developer side, even if you don't collaborate with a designer, you can still adopt this thinking. You can still think about your product in a way that is user-centered, and goes by this process. The second big takeaway, like I mentioned before, is that the value of Nostr being a decentralized information protocol, I think, really, really depends on more people building and contributing to projects. So that's why I want to give this talk. It's like, to y'all in this room and to people listening, if you have projects, if you have ideas, if you have things that you'd like to see built in the world, especially in the world of software, Nostr is very open, it's very collaborative, and this is what I'm trying to emphasize here, is that I would love to see more people get involved. Get involved in thinking about designing products, using that design process, so that Nostr can actually grow and have some of the benefits that we've been talking about decentralization and censorship-resistant information. Like, none of that happens unless products are made that are actually useful and well-designed. The products won't work otherwise. So, especially if you can't code, in my view, is that this is very much needed. So your contributions, your involvement, and even kickstarting your own project, I think, is just going to be a very valuable thing. So those are the two big points, and that's the call to action, like I just said. Please, that's really the main point of the talk, is not so much that you need to be on Nostr. Like, there's there is cool stuff happening here in some of the other talks that you've had listened to today. A lot of cool, like the culture shock stuff and the stuff that QW is doing and open mic, music. It's very early though. And, I won't pretend to say that like, I know that Nostr is going to grow into the thing that you'll want to use, but in my view, it can only become that thing if more people are involved, building experiences in a way that is user-centered and actually addressing people's needs. Okay, so I have a bunch of stuff. If you are interested in contributing, in doing design, in kickstarting your own projects, this is really just like my personal link list of different resources that I found very useful. I'll go over them very briefly, and then I'll have a QR code at the end, which links to a Nostr post, actually, where I have all of these listed out. But first up are just basic UX resources. So a lot of what I've gone through today is not exclusive to the Bitcoin world, the open source world, or the Nostr world. They're just user experience design principles that you can use to make any kind of software. And these apply to Bitcoin and Nostr because it's still humans at the end of the day that are using these products. So two very good resources there. Laws of UX breaks down UX principles in a way that's very digestible, easy to understand, like pick up kind of laws, notes that you can apply broadly. The other one is another great resource with a lot of education and articles. Builder resources, like I mentioned, going to events, collaborating with people. It's very beneficial for the building of your own skill set and actually making projects. So if you get linked into dev meetups or hackathons or conferences like this one, they'll be very helpful for you if you're interested in this. So those are some resources there. And then Nostr specific resources. If you need like a more in-depth or technical introduction to Nostr than what I gave today, there are a ton of good resources for that. So some of those are listed there. There's a specific Nostr design resource that is very good that I'll go over a little bit now, time permitting. I'm actually out of time, almost. So maybe not. I'll show it briefly, but there's a very good resource made by Carnage, which is one of the accounts to follow for Nostr design. That is very thorough and highlights a lot of the UX principles that we talked about, and also Nostr-specific flows that are going to be useful for you to understand if you're interested in building stuff on Nostr. Another thing to note is that things move very quickly on Nostr, as I think a lot of y'all have heard today. So this is an ongoing conversation about how to accommodate for things that are different about Nostr, like we mentioned with relays. A lot of that infrastructure is different and new to users. So logging in is another big challenge for Nostr-specific apps. So a lot of that conversation is still happening. So if you're interested in keeping up with that conversation or contributing to it on Nostr, follow the hashtag. Not all clients can do that, but if you can search it or if you can follow it, Nostr design, a lot of that conversation is happening there. And there are some accounts to follow here as well for some designers who contribute to some of the larger apps or are just involved in the conversation more broadly. And here is the QR code, if anyone wants to snap that. It's just a post linking to all those links that were there before. Hopefully it works. If it doesn't work, please tell me. Okay. I do not have too much time, and I apologize, because I wanted to go through that much more quickly to have more time to go through some of the specific flows and any questions that y'all have, and look again at some of the artifacts that I didn't get to zoom in on. But that is it. I was going to use the rest of the time to go over some of those resources that I mentioned on nostrdesign.org, but I'll go ahead and open it up to questions now. And that way, if there's a part of the design process that y'all wanted to go over more in depth, or if you had any questions, that's the end of the presentation. So thank you. I'll open it up to questions. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. So I think that's largely a function of the platforms you're on. I think it is kind of like a usability question of, bringing it back to what users actually need. I appreciate, I think you'll have heard today, Flare.pub is just a beautifully designed client. Like it's aesthetically beautiful. It has, or just visually appealing, and its layout is very intuitive, and so is Flockster. Like that developer's work, Zach, very consistent in that regard and very nice to use. But if the question is more geared to like what are the clients that I use specifically, it actually goes back to that my pain point is I have an Android phone. So I'm gonna use an app that is on my Android phone, and honestly, like I'm sorry for a lot of the censorship resistant people. Like I use the Play Store. Like I want it to be on the Play Store. I want updates to be easy, and that's just kind of like my choice for my own, like as a user, my own pain points and my own needs and my own goals. So like my favorite, I'm sorry, the Damus people here. I'm on Android, so Damus is like 2 weeks. I'm excited. Okay, you heard 2 weeks, and then that's the news. Nostr? Oh, that's the one with the guitar, right? A lot of these, the icons, the names, they're very convenient. Yeah, I haven't personally used that one. Yes. Yes. Definitely. He's definitely this is his nostrdesign.org is his resource. That's where a lot of that OpenStats funding went to, is the building of this resource. Very good. Quickly to, I don't think I mentioned the name of the client that I use on the previous question. It's called Amethyst, and like that's my favorite client because like what I was saying, it serves my needs. It's where I need it to be. Yes. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It's something I didn't cover in the presentation of like an intro to Nostr, but the way that Nostr is changed or improved is very much like Bitcoin through these proposals. They're called NIPs on Nostr as opposed to BIPs. And as far as the designer participation in those conversations, personally, I would say my participation is limited. A lot of the conversation is around technical trade-offs, which lead to trade-offs in user experience, but do not always have to be addressed on the protocol level. It's a very similar conversation to Bitcoin, in my opinion, where a lot of these conversations are about whether or not whatever experience we're trying to make actually necessitates changes to the protocol, or whether or not they can be done on a layer above or on the sort of client app layer. Could you have a mixture of a service that has a centralized server for some things, but uses Nostr for other things? And to some, this is like, kind of like a bastardization of the whole concept, but fundamentally it's a trade-off. It's a question of what do users want, what do they need, and how can we build it? So hopefully that answers your question. What was it more? Was it more on specific features you were saying? Definitely. I would say that's what I'm trying to, in the working with developers part of it. I think that will lead you to understand if you do need to participate in whatever improvement proposal conversations. That is something collaborating with developers will be very useful in understanding where you need to have that conversation. So if you present an experience that you want to, again, like for our skateboarder app, and then the technical feedback from the developers, oh, we can't do that because of X, or, oh, well, we can't have private messaging on Nostr because it's not really private and we don't have the infrastructure for that, then I think it makes sense to weigh in and say, well, now I have an opinion about this NIP, 30 or something. And that's already one, I don't know what it is. But I think within the context of building things, it makes sense to have that conversation. Cool. We have 10 minutes. Any other questions?
What are you most excited about at social media or other stuff, apps?
Oh, that's a great question. Y'all should go to Archinox's talk. A lot of what I'm excited about, not to like plug all my stuff, but like what I was gonna say is, to me, I am most excited about the other stuff. So Nostr, if y'all don't know, is an acronym. It stands for Notes and Other Stuff Transmitted Over Relays, which is kind of like goes back to the basic definition of Nostr. Santos, I don't actually have 10 minutes, do I? I'm done. You're done. Okay. Okay. I'll finish answering this question. Y'all should go to Archinox's talk. He's building insanely cool stuff on Nostr that involves, again, like we were talking about, some Nostr, some other technology, some proof of work technology that is not like an X clone. We need the social media use case, but like in this example, the 3D galleries, the gaming client, these are use cases that I think will appeal to users in a different way, because the social media landscape is so heavily dominated by the biggest tech players in the world, and they're putting massive amounts of resources, like I think Avi was mentioning in a previous talk, and it's hard to compete. So truly new experiences, truly other kinds of experiences, I'm personally most excited not only to build, but to also interact with. I think I'll stop now. Thanks, guys.
Grandpa, why do you have so much Bitcoin?
Well, it all started in the year 2023 when I attended a conference called Bitblockboom.
What's Bitblockboom, Grandpa?
It was a conference where people talked about Bitcoin. This was way back when we used something called the US dollar for money.
What? Bitcoin wasn't always the world's money?
If it weren't for great speakers at Bitblockboom like Jimmy Song, Adam Curry, and Preston Pish, we'd all be living in pods and eating bugs. Instead, I was able to avoid fiat enslavement and secure generational wealth.
F***ing legend.
Be the legend your grandchildren deserve. Experience the best Bitcoin conference out there and join the Bitcoin revolution. Bitblockboom, the only conference for true Bitcoin maximalists. Book your tickets today at bitblockboom.com and use the code BBB1 for a special discount.